Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations, our periodic podcast aspect of our online forum. Today, I want to introduce a friend of mine that I met about 5 years ago at Kansas State University. Dr. Rich Myrick is currently serving as the James C. Carey Fellow in Department of History at Kansas State University. He is Lieutenant Colonel, retired from the United States Marine Corps. He earned his commission in the Marine Corps in 1988 through the Officer Candidate course. And he served as a manpower officer in a variety of commands, including 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division Headquarters, the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit Command Element, Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton, 1st Force Service Support Group G1, Military Liaison Team, Croatia, Marine Corps University Education Command, G1, and the Marine Corps Administrative Analysis Team, West Coast. During his career, he served aboard Navy ships and in shore-based commands with deployments to Southwest Asia, East Africa, and Southeastern Europe. He retired in 2008 in the rank of Lieutenant Colonel with 20 years of active service. He and I met online in 2019. I started my doctoral program at Kansas State in history, and I believe that was the same semester you started as well. Isn't that right, Rich?
It is. Same semester.
Yeah. So we went through the program together, and that was a unique time to be going through any sort of thing. But I started online, going through Zoom into classes, which Rich was in person in Manhattan, Kansas. And then spring of 2020 happened, and we were all on Zoom for the next year or so. And we got to know each other pretty well. One of the things that I really appreciated about Rich and that we started to develop a friendship was that it became clear that he was a careful thinker in our classes. And I became aware that he was at least conservative in some of his leanings. And then I started to realize he's probably a Christian as well. And then we ended up doing some book readings on our own, and I got to know him much better. And it turns out, yes, that he was exactly the kind of guy that I like spending time around, that he is very thoughtful and conservative, politically and culturally and intellectually, but also that he is a serious and committed Christian. And we had many fruitful interactions over our time. We read some books that were not assigned to us that we just did on our own for summer reading. And I really enjoyed those and have benefited from his scholarly input and his interactions and encouragement during my doctoral program. And so we were part of a little cadre of guys that really kind of helped one another along and encouraged each other. And he defended his dissertation successfully in 2023. Is that right?
Yes.
And he's currently working on preparing that for publication. But what I wanted to ask him to come and speak to us about today and kind of do a little bit of conversation partner with relates more to do with his military service. So during our conversations, we read a book by Wendell Berry called The Unsettling of America. And we were in our discussion, we started talking about the nature of community. I knew that Rich, along with several of our other friends, were former military. And for whatever reason in my life, a lot of my friends and some of my family have been military servicemen and women. And it's a unique part, unique kind of life. There's a lot of traveling. There's a lot of unique experiences that not everybody else in America has. And so I had started asking them questions about what it was like to serve in that capacity and to be moving around on a regular basis and how community is formed. And then specifically, how do we as Christians minister to people who are in that situation? And so I found that conversation very fruitful for me personally, thinking about how to minister to folks who were in the military, who might only be stationed in my area for a couple of years before they get transferred off somewhere else, and who might be coming into my area they were already mature Christians, and they were looking for somewhere that they could be a part, but with the knowledge that they would probably be gone in another few years. And so I found that a very fruitful conversation, and I know a lot of our churches minister to military men and women. They're closely associated with bases or around bases around the United States, and so I wanted to invite him in today to just kind of talk to us a little bit about what it's like serving in the military as a Christian, give us some kind of insight into how to go about living that kind of a life as a Christian, and then also what can we do as churches to really come around and one bring the gospel to those that are lost, but to also be a welcome home for believing Christians when they're stationed in our area. So, if you don't mind, Rich, well, first of all, thank you so much for being willing to join me and do this. Um, I know I've kind of given the overview of your impressive record and your years of service in the Marine Corps. Can you give us just a little bit of your experience of how you got into the Marines and why you thought that was somewhere you wanted to be?
Yeah, I joke with my family that I do everything through the back door or late or not the way it's in the brochure. I joined the Marine Corps again fairly late for someone joining. So I had already been to college. I'd gotten a teaching credential. This is in the early 80s, so you can do the math and realize how old I am. And I was having a really tough time. We talk about how tough the economy has been over the past decade or so. It wasn't that great in the early 80s either. And I couldn't find the type of teaching job I wanted to do. Thankfully, these days, there's a lot more options specifically for Christians. I was in Southern California and was having a really hard time finding a job. So I was actually doing essentially any sort of work that I could do. This is in Orange County in Southern California, so it's a highly populated area. But I was married in 1983 and I had 2 kids. And there was simply no way I was going to be able to make ends meet. On top of that, and I'm always careful about how I describe this because I don't want to offend or insult teachers, but I was disappointed with the teachers I was around when I was teaching in, these are public high schools. There were some really, really good professional people, and there were a number of others who just weren't. And I wanted to be part of something where the standards were very high, and it didn't really matter where I came from, who my parents were, any of that. I wanted an organization to be part of that is, for lack of a better term, is completely merit-based. And I thought about the military. My family doesn't have a military background at all. My father-in-law had served in the Navy in the early 60s, but he'd long since been out. So I did what I guess a lot of young people do. Now, I was in my mid-20s, had a college degree and kids at home, but it's like an 18-year-old going down to the storefront and going, okay, which one do I go in?
Yeah.
For a number of reasons, I didn't think the Air Force would be a good fit for me, the Army either. I talked to the Navy and that turned me off. So I'm like, okay, there's only one left. So I walked into the Marine recruiter and I told them, you don't need to recruit me. I need to go to boot camp right away. Basically, the idea was this was in like April of 1987. I was looking and I was applying to teaching jobs elsewhere outside of Southern California for that fall of 87. So I needed to go to boot camp and get it done because I wanted to be a reservist. And this is enlisted. And the guy was like, okay, I can get you to MCRD San Diego, the boot camp, which is just down the road, in 2 weeks. And I'm like, okay, signed the paper and off I went. So 2 weeks later, I was standing on the proverbial yellow footprints. Marines will know what this is talking about. Going through all that fun stuff they do in boot camp, wondering why I actually thought that was a good idea. Everybody thinks that, by the way, no matter how prepared they are, like, what did I get myself into? Because I can tell you, Marine Corps drill instructors are very good at making you feel uncomfortable. And so I was in boot camp for about 2 months and I got hurt. I basically ripped some ligaments in my knee during one of the training exercises. And they ended up having to put a cast on my leg. I was unable to finish and they discharged me with a medical discharge. That was in 1987. And what that meant was I didn't leave until October. I didn't have a teaching job. So I'm like, what do I do? Where am I supposed to go? I thought, I have a degree. I'm qualified to be an officer. I have to do something about the knee because I needed a waiver to get back in. But 3 months later, I walked into an officer selection office, also in Orange County, and they grilled me. They said, why on earth would you want to do this again? And I told them, I really liked what I saw, but I want to do something that's more commensurate with what I think my abilities are as an officer. And they're like, okay. And so in October of 1988, I'm at officer candidate school. It was just like that. So I joined for very personal reasons that had to do with wanting something that was more of a challenge and that I didn't have to, because it's just, you have experiences in life. I wanted to be able to do something where it didn't matter where I came from. It didn't matter what I looked like. I just had to perform every day and I'd be rewarded for it. And I can tell you, it wasn't a bed of roses, but 20 years in the Marine Corps, that's exactly what I found. Everything doesn't go your way. You have to stand in line for a lot of things. By that, I mean, there's only a certain number of billets you can get. And I had my ups and downs in my career, but I came to work every day. I did the work that they told me to do, and I got promoted. And next thing you know, it's 20 years in and you're a lieutenant colonel. So the other reason I joined, frankly, is because of the stability it gave to my family. Now, that's a bit ironic because you've already touched on one of the major issues with being in the military. But when it came to pay and entitlements and having a place to live and all of that, the military takes care of that. Now, they take a big bite out of you to do that. There's a reason why they do all that for you. And that reason is you're away from home. You talked about the moves, and I'll get into that in a second, because I think that's really one of the main things that I'd like to communicate to your audience about what that means, exactly what you're talking about with churches. But I was away a lot, even when I was stationed somewhere on deployments. And you mentioned some of the deployments and training and everything else. You're away from home a lot. And that's one of the things that's really tough. I mean, I know you have small children. I had small children as this was going on. And it's a real tough thing to leave them behind and go away for a week, 4 weeks, 8 months, whatever it happens to be, and do that repeatedly over time. Now, they're taken care of in terms of materially, but as a father, I wasn't in the building, so to speak, as much as I would like to be. So that was something that I didn't quite understand. I can tell you, this is how completely naive I was about the Marine Corps. I laugh about this. Here I am with my PhD, but I joined the Marine Corps, didn't realize that Marines spent a lot of time aboard ship. I mean, it's in the name.
Yeah.
You would think I would have figured that out. But I did, especially early in my career. I spent a lot of time aboard ship, which also has its ups and downs, literally, figuratively and literally.
Right.
I didn't expect that. I actually enjoyed it to some extent, but I much preferred to be at home. Now, later in my career, I was at home more. You have benefits, and this is something that I very much, it has helped me later now, actually, in my scholarly career after leaving the military, is that they basically, the Marine Corps sent me to Naval Postgraduate School about midway through my career as a major. So I got a graduate degree in essentially international relations. And then I also went to the Marine Corps Command and Staff College about 3 or 4 years after that and got another master's degree. So I was well ahead in terms of understanding how to do graduate study when I actually started it, getting to a PhD program, which I would not have had because my undergraduate degree, frankly, and this is one of the reasons I like the Marine Corps, because they didn't care. My undergraduate degree was in physical education. So I didn't take any history, frankly.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a shocker to me that I'm where I am now. I should also add that when I left the Marine Corps in 2008, retired, my intention was to go do something completely different. Well, if everybody in your audience remembers 2008, that was a really rough year.
Yeah.
And I once again couldn't find a job that actually met the needs of my family. So I ended up, by the end of that year, I retired in May. In December of 88, I was right back to working for the Marine Corps as a civilian. And I did that for about 11 years. And it was from there that I left, basically civilian federal service, left there to come to Manhattan, Kansas to do the program here.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the gap. So I was really with the Marine Corps for 30 years. Although the last 10 or 11 was as a civilian, it was very, very different. By the way, I was actually working at the boot camp in San Diego on the general staff there. So ironically, the place that I didn't graduate from, I was working on the staff later. It's, life does these things to you.
Yeah, that's right.
The other side of this to kind of maybe help understand why it wasn't as much of a challenge for me personally to do the moves, even though it was a challenge for the family, as I mentioned, was that I'd been moving my entire life. My dad was a pipeline engineer, and I added it up one time. This is a few years ago, so it's changed. I've been here for about 5 years. I averaged a move, an actual household move, about every 2 years my entire life from the time I was born. And we're not moving across town.
Yeah.
I was born in West Texas because guess what? There's a lot of oil in West Texas. So he was designing pipelines. Another place in Texas, in Houston. Then we moved to California. I've lived in all over different places in California, like 7 or 8 different times. Some of that's the Marine Corps doing that to me. Overseas, I lived in Britain, I lived in Egypt as a kid. And of course, with the Marine Corps deployed, you mentioned some of those. So moves themselves are fairly, that's not out of the ordinary for me. But I did tell myself I wouldn't do that to my kids, and I ended up joining the Marine Corps and doing the same thing to them. Now they're very resilient. They're all adults now. They seem to have come out just fine. But it does go into, and I'm really glad you mentioned the Wendell Berry book, because I remember those discussions. It's been 3 years now, but that really hit home. I can tell you that idea of community, if you move as often as someone like I did, and well before the military and then joining the military, you can almost get accustomed to not plugging in where you go. You have to work at it because you almost get good at not being part of things. It sounds strange, but when you're on the other end of it, it's a lot of work, frankly, to do that.
Yeah. And
I was fortunate for about 5-year span. We didn't move when I was about, from 5 to 10 years old. And so that's where by the way, we were, twice on Sunday, Wednesday night Bible study every week family. So I was very fortunate to grow up in a, confessionally Christian, devout. We always seemed to go to Southern Baptist churches, but the family was, there were Methodists and Presbyterians, sort of standard Southern spread of of groups. So I came to Christ in that church right before we left to go overseas. And so I had that grounding, and I always took it with me. And we were always in churches, but after that point, we never stayed very long. So when you're in a place 2 years, what can you do? And I actually have thought about this quite a bit over the past few years because it hasn't gotten any better. It's very difficult to get plugged in that way. What it means for, the individual Christian and their family, and what it means for the church. And we can get into this, but I was in obviously a lot of different churches. Some of them were very good at it. They were very welcoming, and they understood it's what you were talking about. The pastors and elders and anyone else who were involved, and even just the membership of the church, understood the situation that these are Christians who are coming in. They're just not going to be in your church for very long because of the nature of their work. Occasionally I would run into churches and it wouldn't end up staying very long where they weren't welcoming because either they'd had bad experiences with military members, and sometimes that happens, or they weren't willing to put the time and energy into us as members
Mm-hmm.
because they knew we would leave.
Right.
Um, so it's kind of hit and miss. And just finding churches can sometimes be difficult.
Mm.
I have longed for years to have a home church,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm close here.
Yeah.
It's a small town, and it was hard to find a church that quite was the kind of fit for me. But you've got to be in a church where
Yeah.
we're commanded to be in a church. You have to be in that community, and you need it, and you need it to serve,
Right.
and you need it for accountability and everything else.
Sure.
So
Well, yeah, what I was going to say, I want to see if we can kind of pull out some of these themes, and I want to come and kind of address each of these. But I think where you're at is exactly right. Is the fellowship, obviously the formal fellowship of meeting together for preaching and prayer and singing hymns is essential, but also it's in the kind of informal aspects of our lives where we really serve to encourage each other in ways that aren't always even kind of formally spiritual, and I opened by saying my experience at Kansas State has been wonderful in lots of ways, but one of the things that really made it such an enjoyable experience as I've been working my way through the doctoral program was I found Christians of like mind who we could just be an encouragement to one another. It wasn't that we're doing Bible studies once a week or anything like that, but it was just having a similar kind of sensibility, having, being able to work through ideas together that other people weren't, I tell some of students, if I have a Christian young person who's wanting to go to a public university or a secular university, and I encourage them to do that, but I also say, you're probably going to need to do about twice as much reading as everybody else in your class because you're going to need to do all the reading that you're assigned to do, but then you're also going to have to do the extra legwork of how do I approach this from a Christian worldview? And so just having that community there helps you to kind of hold on, to anchor yourself in the midst of, as you face the challenges of life, of all sorts of challenges. And so that's an essential part of that. Mm-hmm. So if we can, let's kind of maybe pull out some of these particular themes that you've brought out. And I would like to, I guess maybe let's start with a kind of a basic question. I think this was assumed in our society and in our culture even a generation ago, but certainly more than that. But, why is it a valuable thing to serve in the military? Why should Christians think of it as what are some good arguments for saying, this is a good career for you, but it's also a good way for you to serve your community? What are some things that you think are really good arguments for the goodness of serving in the military?
Well, I'll start. I'm going to answer your question, I promise. But I'll start by telling you I am not a recruiter, and you've not accused me of being one. But there are young Christians, really others, but particularly we're talking about Christians here, who I would tell it's probably best that you don't.
Right.
Especially, particularly immature Christians, because going to the military, it's a secular institution. There's religious undertones to it, has been for a long time. Military tends to attract more conservative and probably more of kind of the group of people that we come from in terms of conservative, Bible-believing people. Nonetheless, it's a secular institution, and particularly over the past few years, it's gotten somewhat more hostile to Christians. It's a lot like going to a public university in that you have to be prepared for that, and you have to seek out other Christians, kind of like what we did at Kansas State, because otherwise you're in trouble. You could get yourself into trouble in a place like that. And I know of Christians who joined the military and weren't ready for it. The other part of this is there are very different ways to serve in the military. You can do a 3 or 4 year enlistment and then you leave. That's what most people do. For instance, in the Marine Corps, at any given time, roughly, I don't know what the exact numbers are now, 70 to 75% of the Marine Corps are first termers, and they will only do that initial and then they'll leave.
Mm.
And that includes a lot of the officers too. So that's actually what I usually advise people to do. Don't commit to a career until you've spent some time doing it. And you're not going to have a bunch of moves when you do that. And you can leave the military having gained from that. This is sort of the J.D. Vance story, getting your act together in the military and going and doing other things. So you don't have to, I mean, you could have your act together when you go. There are benefits to that. There are material advantages. There's pay and entitlements. You will learn a skill of some type or another, depending on what your specialty is. And then the less obvious things that we do talk about is the challenge of it. I sort of touched on that. I can tell you every day I was in the military was hard. Every day was hard. Every day was a challenge. And every day I had to kind of figure out what to do because they don't necessarily tell you. It's like, here's the mission, go do it. So in terms of Christians, in terms of serving, and it's sort of more broadly, my answer would be, as somebody who's been through this and now is looking back on it and maybe would advise people, I think it is important for Christians to serve in a public institution of the Commonwealth. I think we are a better nation, thinking in terms of, the community outside, the national community, if we have Christians in positions of responsibility, and specifically, in this case, in the military, because of what the military does. Christians, it's a Matthew 5 issue here. It's a salt and light. We need to be there. It's not for everyone, but it's a better military for doing that. There's also the other side of this that I know for me, it wasn't as necessary, but still I learned a lot about a lot of different people being in the military because you don't really get to choose who you serve with.
Yeah.
You get orders and you're all together and you learn about people from all different parts of the country that you may never have served with before. And you really do become a band of brothers. It's the nature of it because of how difficult the work is. Yeah. So there's those aspects of it. As a Christian, for me, it's, and I did look at it this way, it is a mission field.
Right.
It wasn't a formal mission field, but of course, I always wanted to be a model for other people. And it was something that I did get a lot of feedback on. Yeah. Because I would draw lines. Just one quick example. I don't consume alcohol, and there were, of course, a lot of Marines who do. And so I was in situation time after time after time where Marines would come up to me and thank me for, as an officer, not consuming alcohol because they didn't want to, but they didn't know how to handle that pressure. And so it was a great conversation about a lead into why I chose to do that, what the scriptural basis in my mind was for that. I know there's disagreements about that, but I feel strongly about that, and I know your denomination does too.
Yeah.
That this is something that actually leads into a discussion that I otherwise wouldn't have, because remember, this is a secular institution, and as an officer, proselytizing really is round on. But you're modeling it anyway.
Yeah.
And so being a Christian in that situation, I can tell you, I don't believe, and I'm trying to recall if there was ever a situation where I felt like I was being either forced to or pushed into doing something that I thought violated my beliefs. And that was not the case.
Right.
Now, I left the military in 2008 in terms of active duty. So that's my experience.
Yeah, there's a little bit of difference there, but yeah. So what I would, first of all, I really appreciate the way that you mentioned and kind of emphasize there's a calling we have to serve our community. It's part of our following Christ, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And part of that is this defense of your neighbor as well, and preparing for that. Because, and I don't want to, I'm not trying to, what would you call it, downplay the importance of this, but oftentimes in my circles, when Christians who are really serious, committed Christians who are also serious about giving their whole life to the Lord. When they talk about going to the military, they're just like, well, I want to be a chaplain. And we need chaplains. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have those, but there's a part of me that goes, well, yes, but I mean, there's lots of people who I know who are serious, committed Christians. They are not cut out to be chaplains. But they would say, well, then if I'm just serving in the military, it's just so I'm, it doesn't have anything to do with my Christianity. It's really just because I want to go serve. I feel patriotic, or I feel like I want to be a part of serving my community, or I'm looking for exactly that stability and kind of getting my life together, or whatever it is. And they don't connect those things. But I actually think that those are deeply intertwined, and that we as Christians, not all of us are called to serve in this capacity, but when we are, it's a service not just to our fellow man, not just to our community, but also to God, as we love our neighbor as ourself, as part of the second, great commandment. And so, and that I think that also reconnects us to the goodness of God's creation, right? God isn't just interested in saving our spirits, and he's not just interested in saving me for eternity, but he's also making all things new through us. And when we get to serve in these kinds of areas, we get to be a part of making that little corner of creation new. And it's in these small ways where it's not that you're officially going around telling everybody, hey, I'm a Christian, and I'm not doing these things for these reasons, and I'm not doing that thing for that reason, and I think we should do this thing because, but instead, you build relationships with people that cross boundaries. You get to build connections with non-Christians in ways that, frankly, I don't often get the opportunity to do, because I work in a Christian organization, which I enjoy doing. It's great in many ways, but I have to work a lot harder at building deep relationships with people who aren't Christians. And that gives you a really natural way to build those connections. And I think it helps. I think sometimes as Christians who are particularly kind of, committed to biblical Christian lives, we just kind of, we fail to see the commonality we have with non-Christians, people who come from radically different backgrounds. As you said, in this situation, you get put together with people from very different situations, very different backgrounds, geographically, socioeconomically, education, religion, all of that. But you start to forge a common identity. You start to see where those commonalities lie that are there, and then you can build those close relationships. And so I just think that's a wonderful aspect of military service that doesn't get talked about by Christians when we talk about military service oftentimes, and maybe not even by the military today. Much of their advertising has to do with career options and things like, which I'm not saying that's a bad part. I think that's actually a really great bonus that comes along with that. But there is this, as Christians, a clear motivation of, we want to be good members of our commonwealth, of our community, to be active participants, and to serve one another as Christ serves us. And that's also, and maybe more even especially, serving unbelievers and showing them the love of Christ in that. So I love that explanation and that description of that. And now you said, and you've mentioned, you don't remember ever being like put in an ethically bad situation by, official commands or anything, other than just the normal kind of, living around people that are from lots of different backgrounds. But
Right.
Do you think there are some unique challenges that come with going into the military that, just this is a real problem, or this is something that's really difficult? And then on the reverse, are there also some really unique opportunities that you think the military provides for Christians in their lives, or maybe if they want to serve their community as well?
Anytime you're in an organization, particularly where you have deployments, where people are away from home.
Yeah.
Sometimes the people you're around do things that you consider to be immoral.
Yeah.
Now, that's not only on deployment, but it seemed to be highlighted on deployment. I found the deployments, particularly the shipboard deployments, could be a problem in that. And so at times I had to make a stand for what I would do, and it made me unpopular.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't going to go down with, some of the other officers to the bar scene
Mm-hmm.
in Kinville in Okinawa, where I knew they were going to get into trouble, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
And I would advise them against it. And with some of the other people who are more like me, including, by the way, our chaplain in that unit, I would actually drive and try to pick these guys up when they got in trouble. So you're ministering to them, but it was uncomfortable is not the right word. It was frustrating because when I joined, I had this idea, this picture in my mind of the officer and the gentleman, and they were officers, but they weren't gentlemen.
Uh-huh.
Not all of them. Now, these were young officers, but to me, there's no excuse because you have a much higher standard I was talking about. So the institution and the people in it don't always live up to what your expectations are. This is even beyond, looking at it as a Christian, but certainly as a Christian, it's harder to cope with. Those were the types of things that would grate on me from time to time. And it was usually when people were away from home. Now, this is not going to shock anybody.
Yeah. Right.
But it was something where I several times would make an unpopular stand and just tell people, you should not do this.
Mm-hmm.
I can't order you not to do it because you don't report to me, but you're not doing the right thing here. And they would go do it anyway. And so it's a difficult situation because it's not just being around people and you choose to go one way and they'll go the other. It's you're actively trying to prevent someone from doing something that they shouldn't do, that is going to lead to some sort of immoral act. And it's not going to get them arrested necessarily. It's not going to get them court-martialed, but it's not good for them, and it's not good for the people around them.
Right.
So things like that. As far as unique opportunities, look, I mentioned how hard it is, and I don't want to stress that to the point where people think it's just, it's prison time. It isn't. I really wanted that challenge. Now, there are times I'm like, I don't know if I really wanted this challenge, but that prepared me for everything else that I've done since. Coming to do graduate school, a PhD program, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it wasn't anything like what I had gone through in the military as far as the discipline and the time management. The other thing, though, and I'm going to speak particularly as a Marine, because the other services have different cultures. In the Marine Corps, and I retired as a lieutenant colonel. I spent most of my time as an officer, so I was in charge of Marines. But leadership or being in charge is something the Marine Corps stresses, maybe more than the other services. It's a saying you have in the Marine Corps that if you have two Marines in the room, one of them is in charge, even if they're both privates.
Yeah.
This private has an earlier date when they showed up in boot camp, so they're in charge. And that's stressed in the Marine Corps to the point it was really a surprise to me when I got on ship and realized that the Navy considered 04s basically a major equivalent, a lieutenant commander, as a junior officer. I was shocked because as a Marine lieutenant, you're in charge of things. Meaning as an 01. Now, not a whole lot, but you from the beginning, you're being trained to do this. It gets to be second nature to you.
Mm-hmm.
When you walk in a room, you understand you're in charge and you're responsible. So this idea of both authority and responsibility is inculcated in you without you even really getting it.
Yeah.
And the other part of that, and this is something that, again, I'm not a recruiter, but I can tell you it really was something I experienced in the Marine Corps. It was part of the culture. Something akin to what occasionally Christians will refer to as servant leadership. I'm not sure if I like that term, but you understand what I'm getting at. If you're an officer in the Marine Corps, you're referred to as an officer of Marines. You exist because of the Marines. It's not about you. It's not about your rank. It's not about your privileges.
Mm.
You as an officer in the Marine Corps, and this also way goes for non-commissioned officers, so sergeants are really corporals and higher. You are responsible for others, and that is how you're evaluated, what they do. It's like being a coach.
Mm.
If the team doesn't win,
Yeah.
so you can be the smartest, greatest, most brilliant officer. If you can't prepare, train, lead your Marines to do their mission, whatever that happens to be, you might as well find another line of work. And you probably will, because they will get rid of you.
Mm-hmm.
That's generally the way it is. Those are things that they don't necessarily make it to the recruiting brochures, but it was something I know I had never experienced because I'm an introvert. I always took care of my own business. I got really good grades in school. I didn't have to worry about anybody else. And suddenly I taught high school, and that was a little different, but getting into this situation where these people literally depend on you.
Right.
They're looking to you to keep them safe and to train them to do their job properly. It's a tremendous responsibility, but it's also a tremendous responsibility. So you have to, those are things, and by the way, in Marine Corps, you're talking about once you get to be a corporal, formally, you're an NCO. It's the other services don't start that. Then, a corporal is an E4.
Okay.
So you're literally, everybody makes it past private out of boot camp, private first class, lance corporal. Once you make corporal, you're considered to be a non-commissioned officer. You have legal responsibilities.
Mm.
So those are things you're not going to get anywhere else. It's one of the recruiting pitches they do have for officers and NCOs, and it's a good one, is that if you, in the civilian world, which by the way, of course, you have responsible opportunities and everything else as
Right.
well. You're not going to get it like that soon in that kind of environment where you're held accountable and you're also rewarded for doing it well.
Right.
So those are things I would look at. And like I said, there's always, it was very rare in my time in the Marine Corps that I worked for somebody who I didn't really care for.
Sure.
There were a couple of them.
Yeah. Well,
Also a couple of them.
I guess the thing that comes up as we were talking through this is, I think sometimes the concern, and maybe it's because also the age range of a lot of new recruits is 18 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fresh-faced, not a lot of experience. And if you don't have a really good sense of who you are, there's your opportunities to mess up stuff when you're deployed are a lot higher. You're away from home for the first time, all that. But as we were talking about it, I was thinking, yeah, those are all the challenges you're going to face if you go to work at the construction site. Like I've worked on some construction sites, and buddy, they have plenty of temptations there.
Yeah.
And it's just as kind of rough a crowd as it can be. And the same goes if you go to work at a bank or a business downtown. You're going to run into all sorts of different kinds of people. So you're going to learn those things. So those challenges, I think while sometimes they are magnified when we think of that particular experience, it's not something that's that radically different. And I love those opportunities, that kind of my experience. So I never served in the military. When I was 18, I was just not interested at all. I had a close friend who I grew up with, was a close friend with. He wanted to be a SEAL. And so he wanted to be in the military. He wanted to be special forces. And it just held no appeal to me at all. And that was because I was a very undisciplined 18-year-old. And I had no desire to be more disciplined. But in my 30s, I started looking back and going, that probably would have been a great experience for me. And it probably would have done me a lot of good for the exact reasons you're saying, which is you get some structure, you get some order, but also you get these opportunities to really show in a material way, here's how I can lead, and I'm expected to do that. And when I do it, I get rewards. And when I don't do that, you get clear, like there's a very clear structure of reward and discipline for, your behavior. And, maybe this also plays into it. I don't know why this is. This has been on my mind for the last couple of years, but for whatever reason, I think maybe it seems I always assumed everybody had the same number of military friends, but I've been talking to other people. For whatever reason in my life, I've just kind of always had people that were in the military around. And my experience was I always loved spending time with them because they seem to have a lot more, what you might consider horse sense to them. Like they just kind of weren't going to get caught up in something silly as much. They were much more kind of, this is what works, this is what doesn't. This is a very real understanding of the world. And they, uh, obviously, I'm generalizing, and there's plenty of people in the military who would not fit this, but they just tended to have a better sense of kind of themselves and what works in the world and not getting hung up on appearances or things of that nature. And it seems to me that part of that is that constant review process and this emphasis on leadership. And you're right, the Marine Corps culture is different from Army culture, which is different from the Navy, and even within there's lots of divisions.
That's true.
And so, my experience, I grew up very close to Fort Campbell, which is where the 101st Airborne. And so a lot of my folks that I knew were airborne and or were related to the airborne.
They're a lot like Marines, actually.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking as you were talking. I was like, yeah. And, but I've had friends that came from, the Air Force and the Navy as well. And so I think each of them kind of has some of those elements that are really, they're good opportunities for personal growth and also teach you how to face challenges and problems in the world with your own kind of independent. I love that idea that like, here's your mission. Now you have to figure out how to do it. Like we've given you the tools, but you have to be creative in that process. That really that's an excellent tool for the rest of your life because all of life is a series of, puzzles you got to unravel in some way.
And it starts from you literally. There's part of they say it's not all evaluation, but it is when you're in officer candidate school. One of the things they do are essentially scenario-based problem solving in a physical setting. Here's this situation. You have to cross this stream. You have these things, and it's like go, and you just have to figure it out. Leading a group of other officer candidates, and it's sink or swim, literally. And that's daunting to some people. I probably wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been in that situation, or if I didn't have this, I want to get this commission, so I'm going to do this, even though it's really uncomfortable. And then once you get through it and you realize, I can really do this. It's a confidence building thing. I wanted to touch on one thing when it comes to culture, because I did mention the lieutenant commander in the Navy situation. I want to be fair to the Navy. Marines do serve a lot with the Navy. I'm a little familiar with the Air Force. My son was in the Air Force for about 10 years, a few years ago. But I know more about the Navy because Marines, they're part of the Department of the Navy. They serve with the Navy all the time. The naval chaplains are the chaplains for the Marine Corps doctors. So we're around Navy a lot. But being aboard ship was a real eye-opener for me because of that culture. We like to say there's nothing more full of himself, no person more full of himself than a Marine Corps captain. And that's probably true. You've been in long enough to have the service culture of, we're the best, we're the greatest, the world's greatest fighting force, but you really haven't been around long enough to realize, well, okay, but we're not perfect. Once you get to be a field grade officer, major, lieutenant colonel, you're like, okay, let's get real on this. But as a captain, you're a believer. So I was deployed as a captain. I was a little older, so I didn't quite have that same attitude, but a lot of my fellow captains did. Getting aboard ship and seeing fellow O3s, so Navy O3s are called lieutenants, the Navy with their funny rank thing, who we thought were the weakest leaders. They couldn't seem to find their way around the ship. They didn't seem to know how to do anything. We wouldn't have put them in charge, of a cakewalk. Whereas as Marines, we're doing, these Marine captains are company commanders in charge of 200 Marines in full combat gear.
Yeah.
And we're like, what is going on here? Well, being aboard ship for about a month completely changed my perception of that. And I came away from it. The little axiom I have is I wouldn't want naval officers in charge of Marines, and I wouldn't want Marine officers in charge of sailors.
Ah,
And the reason was this, and I still think about this. I was aboard some fairly large ships. These are probably a personnel, not quite an aircraft carrier, but a large amphibious assault ship. So they probably had a complement of about 1,200 sailors on board. And you add to that almost 2,000 Marines. There's a lot of people on board that ship. Every sailor on board that ship, from their most, lowest rank up to the captain, had a very specific job. It's like a machine.
mm,
And when it works beautifully. But if you try to move outside that box into somebody else's area, literally in that constricted place where everybody has a job,
right.
you will mess it up. There is no leeway. With a Marine, you have to, that idea of making it up as you go or figuring it out. They don't do that in the Navy, not as a routine, because they can't.
Yeah.
Because everyone has a job. It was a surprise to me being in the Navy. They don't refer to ranks; they refer to your rate. So someone is a bosun's mate. So that's their job, or they're a yeoman. That's their job.
Right.
They think about the job, whereas a Marine, it's always the rank. It doesn't really even matter. Of course, it does in the end. You don't want an infantryman flying an F-18,
Right.
but in the Marine culture, it's who you are as a leader within that group.
Mm.
In the Navy, it's how do you fit within that machine.
Right.
And I was amazed when I stepped back and realized what I was seeing was a very different culture. They're very good at what they do. I know the Navy's taken some hits lately, but quite literally. But they and they're out there all the time.
Yeah.
At any given time, I couldn't tell you how many ships, and I no longer have classification authority, but we have Navy ships floating all over the world and under the sea,
Right.
24/7.
Right.
And so it's not that the Navy officers can't lead. It's that the way in which they have to lead in order to be effective is very different from what Marines do. So these are, I mean, if you're looking for how you want to learn something, you're going to learn a job skill in the Navy much more readily than you are in the Marine Corps.
Yeah. Well, and so anyway, this is maybe an aside, but I'm fascinated by this. One of the things I loved in our courses at Kansas State, because they're connected with a military base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They have a military history emphasis there, the graduate program. And so I was able to take a couple of military history courses. I think, we took one. It was the greatest hits of military history, as I recall.
Yeah.
And it was a great course because I got a broad survey. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted a broad survey of military history. And in there, some of the reading that we did, there was one in particular, and the name of the book escapes me, but it dealt with the relationship of the state to the military.
I think it's the Huntington Soldier in the State.
That's it. That's exactly right, Huntington. And even though I don't think our professor was a big fan of that book at the time, but
not at all. No.
But I was very I enjoyed the book for lots of reasons, but one of the things that was very helpful was he kind of helped me to see how those different cultures within the military, they all do kind of flow out of their unique missions.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, and as conservatives, we would also say, yeah, that's the particularity of creation, which is just because this thing works in this place, it doesn't mean it would work the exact same way in this place. In fact, you would probably need a whole different kind of system that fits that mission and that context better. And so, that was a fascinating part of that discovery, was how those unique cultures developed. And then this is kind of the juicy part of it, the kind of soap opera element of it, which was the infighting between the various branches to try to say, well, we can handle all of this, and then the Air Force saying, well, we don't need we can just bomb our way to victory from now on.
Yeah, and I think that book I believe it was published in the 50s. It was going back a ways.
Yeah.
So I've truth in advertising, I don't call myself a military historian. When I came to do a graduate program, I decided and no offense to those who do, I didn't want to be the military officer who then went right into doing military history. I try to avoid, sorry guys, cliches.
Right.
Nonetheless, I'm still interested, and it's hard. I mean, I spent 30 years with the Marine Corps, so you pick up on these things.
Yeah.
I've done my own sort of research because I'm working on another project that has to do with defense unification. So a lot of the things that he was talking about, fighting over roles and missions after the end of the Second World War,
Right.
I've been reading it. It was really harsh because Truman cut the budgets and
Yeah.
those are things. Where does the military? I thought about this a lot because I grew up. I was born in the 60s. I grew up. I remember the end of the Vietnam War. I came into the latter stages of the Reagan military, and then all the things that happened in the 90s and the 2000s. Anyone really, most of us around today have never been in the United States or experienced our country that didn't have a frankly massive standing military, not just army.
Yeah.
Whereas before World War II, that really wasn't the case. It was a dramatic shift.
Right.
In fact, the history, having done some of this, looking at it in the past with American military history that we get to do here when we're going through coursework, I came away from it thinking, by the way, this is actually one of the exams I did for my comps, I came away from thinking the U.S. is basically, using the same term I used earlier, made it up as they went. The reason why it takes the U.S. a while to get sort of ginned up in a war is because we just aren't prepared for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I definitely saw it World War I and World War II. It took a little while to do that. But anyway, that kind of connection that you're making is exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They do give you opportunities, by the way. And I mean, it's the they, but having been to some of the schools like Command and Staff College, Naval Postgraduate School, where I was around a lot of people from other services. And in fact, they all civilians. I mean, in my conference group at Command and Staff College, we had an FBI agent. We had officers from overseas. We had a Swedish officer. We had an officer from Georgia. That's like the Republic of Georgia. You always have to define that.
Yeah.
Navy, Marines, Air Force, all these different people with these different experiences sitting around a table talking about the theory and nature of war. It's fascinating because they all have different experiences they're bringing to it. They've been in, like, you're a major, 04 when you're at the school. So these are things that are constantly provoking your thought, maybe not necessarily unsettling, but thinking beyond where you were.
Right.
And so this is obviously, you don't have to be a Christian to plug into that. But as a Christian, what an opportunity to learn about things far beyond what where you're from.
Yeah.
And I sometimes living overseas as a kid, I distinctly remember being in Egypt, and some of the people we knew there were missionaries, Christian missionaries, and what a terrible place to have to operate, and yet that's where God called them to go, right. And they were serving in the capacity for the Lord, but what a trial and a challenge it was to do that, because you're talking about a country where it's quite literally illegal to proselytize to Muslims.
Right.
And so what do you do? And so what does that have to do with this other stuff we're talking about? It has to do with understanding the cultural aspects that are going to influence how you actually interact with Christians, certainly, but non-Christians in those environments.
Yeah.
Real eye-opener for me, it being in that situation, living in a Muslim country and hearing the call to prayer 5 times a day. Actually, I always tell people it was 15 times a day because there were 3 mosques in our town and they never synchronized. And they blared over loudspeakers. So yeah, it was an interesting, I mean, I'm 12, 13 years old living in this country.
Yeah.
And so you don't come away from that not having
Yeah, that's right.
understanding that the world you grew up in, the world that you're comfortable in, that you are part of, not just being an American, but being a Christian in a Christian community. That's not the way everything is.
Right.
And how big the world is and how big that mission field is. So I know
Yeah.
I diverted there, but it to me they're connected. And my experience in the military only augmented things that I had learned as a child living
Yeah.
overseas.
So that is that. I don't know, that I think to me has been something I've really been trying to work on. I've been working personally, just trying to develop my witness and how to reach out to people who are unbelievers in my community. And part of it is I have to be very intentional because I don't get those opportunities very often, if I'm not, because of my job situation and all of that. But you can't do that if you don't have an openness to trying to understand who people are, where they're at right now, and to desire a relationship with them simply for that reason, right? So I think sometimes when we talk about reaching the lost, we only talk about it in that context, which is we got to get souls saved. Well, we do want to do that, but it always seems to me that if that's our motivation, that comes across in our conversations with people, and they don't feel like we actually value them as themselves in who they are. And I think that is a bad way for us to think about those things. And what we really need to do is to recognize that they are good and that God created them. That doesn't mean they're redeemed, and they do need to be redeemed. They need to know about Jesus. But people are a wonderful, wonderful creation, and they are delightful. And there are some really unfortunate personalities that can make that uncomfortable. But generally speaking, and even they're only that way because of, that either sin has corrupted them really badly or they have been horribly harmed by people.
Mhm.
But getting to know people and to understand, and even people who are very hard to understand, to start to realize they're not that way just, you know, because like there's a reason there, and there's a common humanity we want to draw on, and to be fascinated by why is it that this person's different than me? They have very different tastes than me, and these things and these things and these things. Why is that? And take interest in them as people. And I think that experience that you're talking about in the military, and then just kind of being in different cultures a lot, that really helps build that um, in a good way. And so I've been trying to cultivate that myself. Some people that I've been trying to build relationships with, I've been upfront that I'm a Christian, and they know that, and they know that I go to church, and I've even said, we'd love for you to come to church. But that's not been most of my conversations. Most of my conversations have been more about what are they interested in, showing care for them. So I think that that's a maybe more organic way to reach the lost, but it doesn't feel like those. I think the reason that we're kind of, or at least I'm saying I'm generalizing, maybe me, that the context I came out of was the 1950s, 1960s. Make a list of people in the neighborhood that you want to see in church next week, and then you're going to make that happen. And
Mhm.
I'm not even being critical necessarily. I just for me that feels a little bit too mechanistic and not organic enough, and reflective of people in reality. But
No, you're hitting on something that I mean, you were talking about the transience of being in the military and all these sorts of things. But I would encourage you to do what you're doing. Um, I, I'm not as young as I used to be. I bring that up only because I've realized over the years you don't necessarily. I know you know this, but I'm going to repeat it. You don't necessarily get to see the fruit of your labor. And what you're doing with these people you're talking about, cultivating these relationships, you might not see them in your church,
yeah,
but that doesn't mean that your impact on them, the Lord working through you, isn't going to eventually lead them there. You just might not see the fruition of that. And I know you know this, but having seen this over the years, I'm always surprised about people I hear about or I find out about or have contacted me who I've impacted. Um, and of course, it wasn't me, but it was me doing everything I could to live a Christian life. And people notice that. They see that. They might not tell you directly, but it impacts the way they think about things. And you're part of a team, I guess is the way I would put it. But yeah, I come from like I said, I grew up in Southern Baptist churches. The altar call was the most important part of,
Yeah,
of the service. And if somebody wasn't walking down that aisle, it wasn't a good Sunday. I'm not trying to make light of it. I understand that it's where it has to be the primary focus. But we're not, again, we're not the ones who save souls.
that's right.
Jesus does
That's right.
that. We're part of the team. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, no, and so that actually leads us into what I kind of wanted us to close our time with was we kind of talked a little bit about what it's like to be a Christian in the military. I would like it if you could maybe, and in this way, just be very, very practical. What are some things, and some of them are going to probably be the obvious things that we would suggest, but what are some very practical things that if you're going to be a Christian serving in the military, you need to do to make sure you maintain a healthy spiritual life as you go through your unique challenges, which may include, by the way, um, experiencing extreme violence and all the things that come with that.
It's
So
possible.
what are the specific things that someone should do? And then in your experience and in people you've been around, what have you found most helpful from churches who are trying to minister to people who are in the military? And I think what you just said is actually a good jumping off point there is if you're going into ministering to people in the military expecting to see on the ground, what do you call it? Material, calculable things you can put in a record book results. That's maybe not the most helpful way to go. But anyway, let me ask if you can kind of touch on those 2 points.
I think my sort of general advice on a practical level, and I did this before I joined. I didn't, like I mentioned, I didn't come from a family of military people. I hadn't really thought about it. I wasn't quite as, I'm never going to do that as you were. But it wasn't something that seemed to be in the cards for me. So I hadn't really thought through scripturally the basis for these things. And I won't go into all the details of it, but I would very definitely sit down with a spiritual advisor, hopefully a pastor, an elder, someone who maybe has some understanding of this, and go through those issues. Because I can tell you when I first started thinking about it, the second commandment was kind of a stumbling block for me. And I had to really get into what that really means and how it fits into what military said. Would I be able to actually, kill somebody in a combat situation? So that's not, most people in the military are never going to be in that situation. To make that clear, very few people, I don't know what the percentages are, but it's in the single digits, are ever truly in a combat situation. Nonetheless, you could be, and you're part of an organization that's trained to do that. So you have to get your head around that. So just scripturally, and of course, there are some Christian groups that tell you, no, you can't serve in the military and be part of our group.
Yeah.
So those are things you need to be, your Christian community and your understanding of who you are as a Christian is more important than serving in the military. So I would do that. Now, I know that the average 17, 18-year-old is probably not going to be thinking of this. They're going to be looking at the travel and the pay and all, and the excitement that they expect. I would still encourage people to do that because at some point you're going to be faced with these things. I was never in a direct combat situation. The closest I had was a ship I was on somebody was very poorly aimed RPGs landing in front of the ship. That's about as close as I came. Nonetheless, I was around some things that were violent and I was a casualty officer. So I definitely, you have to be able to deal with those things. Second, understand that when you join the military, once you're out of your training and you're sort of in this sort of sequestered training environment, immediately get yourself into a local church as close as you can to what you are, what your denominational group is. There's usually, I didn't find that to be necessarily a problem. But if you've grown up in a home church the way most of us did, it's a little different for me, but I did have what I considered a home church. It's hard to start a new community all over again. You're accustomed to things. And by the way, you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be part of that group and know people inside and out. Well, that's not going to happen, understand, because you're going to be moving. But seek it out and do it. A church situation. I don't remember any time I was in the military as far as being stationed somewhere where those opportunities weren't available. There are going to be churches around. They might be small. They might be meeting in a gym. You never know what, they're not going to have been there for 150 years. They might not be exactly what you're used to, but get yourself plugged in. The second thing, and this was very helpful to me because of course you're not there all the time, is to seek out, and never had a problem doing this, finding other Christians in the commands I was in and doing that weekly Bible study, doing a weekly prayer group, and being accountable to each other within your unit. This was also, and I don't think, hopefully this won't be controversial to anybody, some of my best friends in the Marine Corps, still to this day, long after I've retired, are Catholic. And we've had some of the best conversations about doctrine because you're in these situations where you're actually having to confront things and deal with them. And I feel this was actually a field where I could help educate them about things that they didn't know, because my experience, without going down another rabbit hole, is that Catholics, as much as most Protestants don't know a whole lot about Catholicism, Catholics know nothing about Protestantism. In fact, a lot of Catholics don't know a lot about Catholicism. Nonetheless, these were serious people, mass every week type Catholics. And so we had some great discussions. So I wouldn't push away from that.
Sure.
But I definitely, as far as the groups and accountability groups and everything else, I wanted to be around those who are from the tradition that I'm from, because that's where you really need that. There's enough differences. Yeah. So seek that out. And those are really the two most practical things I can think of. And it's not as difficult as it sounds. It's just, if you're used to being in, I'm not trying to disparage it, but in a comfortable home church, the way I actually hope most people are, because you have long-term relationships and everything else. If you're in that situation, you have to adapt, because you still need that connection. It's not going to be a home church. It's not going to be the type of fellowship you're used to, but it still is the body of Christ, and you're still working with your Christian brothers to do this, and to help to sort of encourage each other, the kind of things you were talking about before. I think that was only the first question you asked me. Something else.
Well, what I want to know is it, and this was, I think, how this whole idea started, because when we were discussing the Wendell Berry book, I asked this question of you and our friend Bryant, who was also in there. But what are some ways that you have found most helpful for churches ministering to military members who are in their area for a short amount of time or a long amount of time? But what are some things we can do that, that military families particularly are going to want some or need some help and assistance with?
Right. Just one quick anecdote. I remember being in a small group at a church that we were in Southern California while I was, it was actually my first long tour at Camp Pendleton in the San Diego area. And it was a mixed group. Not everybody in there was from the military, but it's one of those military communities next to a church, and the church attracted a lot of military people. And there was a young couple that just come in. The husband was a lieutenant, and he had just deployed. And the spouse, who was maybe 21 years old, 22, something like that, she was in this meeting, and we were having our opening prayer. And after that, she just broke down crying. And you understand, Cheryl and I married in 1983, well before I came in the military. We had 2 kids. We'd already been through all the early years of, matrimonial poverty and everything else, all the tumult. She's made of steel. And when I saw this young woman break down in front of people that she hardly knew because of the stress and the pain she was in, because her husband, who they'd only been married, less than a year, was going to be gone for all this time, and who knows where he was going. I didn't realize how important it was for people to be around them in that situation. So as much as it, and I definitely please, the best church setups I've seen, and maybe you saw this because you grew up next to Fort Campbell, having military ministries where they actually have people in the church who specifically identify and bring in and kind of put their arms around military people when they come in. It's not that the pastors can't do that. It's just it's a helpful way to do that so that they know they've got that sort of smaller scale person, a leader that they can. It's usually a retired military person or something like that that runs those. That's fine. In fact, it's very good. I like to see that. It's not essential. It doesn't have to be that way, but I think that's good. And so you want to actually connect, give these military members something to connect to. But more than that, for me, especially after seeing the impact of a separation in terms of a military thing on this young woman, I wanted that church to have their arms around my family, not just me, not just the military member, not just, and I don't make light of this, but not just thanking me for my service, understanding that they're serving too, that they are sacrificing as a family with, their father being gone.
Right.
And I found that in most churches they did, but you run into some of the same issues because they know those kids aren't going to be there, through school or something like that. So that particular church, by the way, did it very well. They approached Cheryl, my wife, and she became a nursery worker. She ended up actually running the nursery. It gave her something to focus on and to do while we were there. That was, serving the church, but also, frankly, got her mind off the fact that I was gone because I deployed twice while we were in that place.
Yeah.
So practically speaking, I don't like the word, but I'll use it anyway. Is I think pastors, churches, elders, church members need to be intentional.
Right.
It's not just people showing up in your church and sitting in a pew. These are people who have specific needs. They're not special in the sense that they're better than anybody else, but they can bring so much. Military, you already talked about it. Military members can bring so much to a church that you have to understand as that they are transients. And it's not even a matter of, it's not their fault. It's that it's part of the life that they are in. And I will also tell you this, and I saw this quite a bit, especially in Southern California, back when you could actually leave the military and make a living there. I don't know if you could do that now.
Yeah.
Because half of California's now moved to your neighborhood, it seems.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But people doing that one term, that one contract, the one enlisted contract, getting out after 4 or 5 years. That church that they became a part of while they were on active duty then becomes their home church. So they actually do stay around for years or decades or whatever it happens to be. So just keep that in mind. It might not be that they're going to leave. They might actually be around. So I don't think that needs to be the criteria for whether or not you invest, to sort of, so to speak, in somebody. But if they want to participate, I was part of churches at times, a couple of places where I asked to be part of something, and they just never got back to me because it was like, why would we bother getting you into that when you're just going to leave? And I'm like, yeah, but while I'm here, I can actually help you.
Yeah.
Even if it's just, moving chairs or, cleaning up the sanctuary or whatever it happens to be. I want to do something beyond sitting in a pew.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a very helpful, part of what had motivated that is, I'm in pastor circles a lot. I have been for the last 15 years and I've known some pastors who they have a very high percentage of military people come through their church. And what had kind of inspired that was they would get very discouraged by that. And, and I'd always kind of thought I could understand why that would be discouraging, but I was also thinking, I think you're kind of looking at this the wrong way. And I wanted to try to figure out, maybe a little bit more of a better perspective on how we can serve people who are serving the military, and with that recognition that they're kind of constantly moving oftentimes. But you're right, they may not re-up and they may just settle down in that community, or in our case, I have I have a neighbor that just recently moved in. I think at some point they were stationed at Fort Campbell, but then they went off to other places, but then they wanted to come back. Like they just liked the area, so they ended up coming back. Um, so anyway, but I think that's also this idea of we shouldn't necessarily be looking for the calculable results that you can put on a ledger sheet.
Yeah, I don't think that's a productive way of looking at it. But understand that you are part of building and encouraging a Christian, growing as a Christian, because many of these are young people. I thought about this while you were just talking about that. One of the churches that I've been involved with here in Manhattan. For those who don't know, Manhattan, Kansas is a college town, but it also has Fort Riley, an army post just 15 minutes away. And so the pastor that I had heard talk about this here, he's like, yeah, they get me twice because I have students who come in and then they leave. And then I have military come in and they leave. But because of the nature, because he has a core group of people who are in town, there's only maybe 50,000 people in the entire town.
Right.
And that's when school's in session.
Yeah.
So he understood it was a church plant. He understood what he was getting into. Excuse me. He understood what he was getting into when he started it. But it's a constant struggle because, and it's not that he doesn't look at them as Christians or members of his church. It's that how do you plan? How do you go down the line? And it's some of the rudimentary things. You're talking about. How do you judge how you're doing in the community when it seems like every year a third of your people leave? Now you're probably going to get some more, but you have to go out and get them. And so it's probably twice as much work. I know it's the mission, but it takes a certain type of pastor to do that. So I don't blame anyone for being discouraged. But understand the other side of it. This isn't an intentional thing. It's the nature of the community that you're in, if that's the case. Right. And a bigger place, a bigger city, it's not going to be as obvious. A bigger church, it's not going to be as obvious, but the needs are still going to be there. But with a smaller church like the ones they have here in town, it's a real impact because they have people who are very active in the church and then they're just gone. And it's not just one person, it's five or
and I understand there are logistical things like budgets and how many Sunday school classes do we need to have, and those things are legitimate things that I understand. There's a frustration. I think you're right, just kind of going into it with the flexibility, knowing, hey, we're just going to have to be flexible and be willing to make these changes on the go, and on our feet. But
you're going to be blessed by that. You're going to be blessed by it.
Yeah, that's right.
If you dedicate some time to these people. Now, of course, they're not the only people in your church. I'm not trying to assume that.
Sure.
I would look at it, try to look at it as the glass half full in this case.
That's right. And I come back again. You've said this, but this has really been on my mind a lot for the last several years for whatever reason. But some of it's had to do with reading C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, and some of it has had to do with kind of really thinking about the First Baptist congregation in the early 17th century that was down to 12 members. That's the First Baptist congregation, and their leader, their preacher, gets imprisoned. He's the only one that's really educated, the only one that's really wealthy. He gets imprisoned, dies in prison. And I just think a lot about, he must have in that moment. I can't imagine if I were in his position, I would have been tempted to think I've wasted my life. I'm going to die in this dirty London prison cell, and I've led all these people to this, and this I have wasted my life. And he has no idea that 200 years later, the Baptist denomination becomes one of the largest Protestant denominations in the world. And so everything we do has eternal consequences that we probably won't see in our lifetime, that we probably won't see until we get to eternity. And so if we take those perspectives, I think that gives us a lot more encouragement, at least it does to me, to say, yeah, this is a little thing that I'm doing that nobody knows about. And the person that I'm doing it for, who's an unbeliever, they probably aren't even going to care. They don't even see why this is a big deal. But if we're being obedient and we're doing those things that God has called us to do, there are eternal things that are being set in motion that we don't know about. And so I think that helps us to get a better grounding on how to serve all kinds of people, but also how to not get locked down into a perspective that's focused on the here and now and on the moment. So yeah. Well, I so appreciate you taking time to talk with me through all of this, Rich. I always benefit from our conversations. This has been a very unique conversation for us because we've kind of wound through all of the things we like talking about.
Yeah.
And we've touched on a lot of those things. And I appreciate so much your perspective and all you've really been helpful for me thinking through lots of ideas academically as well as spiritually. And so I appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking time for this meeting today. I'm going to encourage those of you that are watching that you will continue to check in for our videos and to read upcoming essays. Be on the lookout for a book by Dr. Myrick one of these days. He's working on his dissertation, getting it ready for publication, and I'm sure that's going to be excellent. So we thank you all for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.